Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Chris Kresser is the CEO of Kresser Institute, the co-director of the California Center for Functional Medicine, the creator of KrisKresser.com, and the New York Times bestseller author of The Paleo Cure. He's known for his in-depth research uncovering myths and misconceptions in modern medicine and providing natural health solutions with proven results. Chris was named one of the 100th most, and I would say top 10, influential people in health and fitness by greatest.com, and his blog is one of the top-ranked natural health websites in the world. He recently launched Kresser Institute, an organisation dedicated to reinventing healthcare and reversing chronic disease by training healthcare practitioners in functional and evolutionary medicine. Chris lives in Berkeley, California with his wife and daughter. Chris, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and welcome.
Ali, the pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me.
Look, I've got so many questions for you. As soon as I told our audience that we were going to interview you, questions came rushing in, so I'm going to limit them. But before we even get into those, I wanted to talk to you about your new book, and obviously we'll link to it in the show notes, Unconventional Medicine. Why did you write that?
I wrote it because we're suffering from the worst chronic disease epidemic the world has ever seen in human history, and we're heading in the wrong direction. In the US, the statistics are that 1 in 2 Americans have a chronic disease and 1 in 4 have multiple chronic diseases, and those numbers are getting worse each year. Almost 30% of kids now have a chronic disease, and that's up from just 12% in 1995, so more than a doubling in a relatively short period of time. So it's pretty scary. And yet the conventional medicine system that we have, although it's very good at addressing acute problems like a broken arm or traffic accident or something like that, it's really not at all set up to deal with chronic disease. So I wrote the book to introduce a different option, a different direction that we could go that would be much more effective at preventing and reversing chronic disease, which is the biggest challenge we face from a healthcare perspective today.
And I'm so glad you did write this, because I don't think people really realize those statistics. And even when you say them, I think people almost can't believe it or can't even fathom it. Can you explain how a collaborative practice model, which is what you're sort of, I guess, saying we have to do, if not adapt or die,
right,
will be one of the potential solutions. So what would you think this would look like?
Well, let's say you go to the doctor now, they get your annual checkup. You have, borderline high blood sugar. In the US, at least, I'm not as familiar with the system elsewhere, but in the US, what will happen is the doctor will look at the numbers and they'll say something like, well, your blood sugar is getting a little high. It's not quite high enough where we prescribe medication yet, but do some exercise and eat better. And that's essentially what will happen. The average appointment time is about 8 to 12 minutes in the US, up to 15 minutes. And that's really all there's time for. The patient will leave the appointment and that advice will go in one ear and out the other. And generally nothing will happen. And then they'll come back 5 years later. The doctor will test again and the blood sugar actually will be high enough now to require medication, and they'll get a prescription for a drug that lowers blood sugar, and then they'll be told to take that for the rest of their life. That is really the typical scenario for this situation, but it could look really different. It could be that you go into your doctor and they find the exact same results, except they say, look, your blood sugar is a little higher than we'd like it to be. You don't have diabetes now, but research shows that without intervention, there's a pretty good chance that this will progress and you will end up with type 2 diabetes. But the good news is we're going to intervene now and prevent that from happening, which is totally possible with the right kind of support. And so we're going to set you up with our health coach that we have on staff, and the health coach is going to work intensively with you to help you to get on a healthy, nutrient-dense, anti-inflammatory diet. They're going to come to your house and help clean out your pantry and go shopping with you, and they'll get you set up with some meal plans and recipes, and then you'll check in with them on a weekly basis to make sure you're sticking with it. And we're also going to refer you to a personal trainer in the local community that we have a relationship with, and he's going to get you set up with a exercise program that will help you lose weight and stick with your diet and make you feel better overall. And the good news is all of that's going to be covered by your insurance plan, because they recognize that The cost of treating a patient with type 2 diabetes is almost $15,000 a year. So if they can prevent you from developing that disease in the first place, and you're still young and in your 40s, they could potentially save $500,000 over your entire lifetime by just spending a little bit of money up front on prevention. That scenario I described might seem far-fetched because it's so far from where we are now, but there's actually no reason, financial or otherwise, that can't happen other than, the will to change the system.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the will to change the system is the big issue. So how does it change when you've got pharmaceutical industry probably won't make quite as much money on this little scenario? And on top of that, you've got potentially GPs that might not be happy either. And then obviously the insurance companies at the moment aren't offering insurance for health coaching.
Yeah, I think the GPs will actually be really happy because most of the GPs I've met really want to help people and they realize they're not doing it, at least to the extent that they would like to. And it's not because of lack of effort or that they don't know even what to do. It's that they're as much victims of the system as patients are. They're frustrated with the short appointment times. They don't have the collaborative care team, nutritionists and health coaches that can help them give the patients the kind of support that they know they need in order to be successful. So I think it's largely not a problem with individual physicians. It's a systemic problem. Definitely the pharmaceutical companies play a big role here, especially in the US. It's less of a problem in other countries, and that's evidenced by the fact that, drugs are cheaper in other countries. The pharmaceutical countries have less of an influence on how healthcare is delivered. Healthcare is objectively and measurably better in a lot of European countries in the UK and Australia compared to the US. But I think what it is it comes down to a paradigm shift. And there are actually some factors that are working in our favor, those of us who are interested in this change. Just today, actually, we published a podcast that I recorded with Pat Charnel, Vipul Vyas, and Laura Conley. And Pat Charnel is actually a CEO of a major hospital system on the East Coast. And he was talking about how the shift is already happening even in the deepest part of the conventional healthcare system, because basically they see the same trend and they see that the way that it has been working is not working. They're not looking at it so much necessarily as a ethical or moral perspective necessarily, but just from a financial perspective, the cost of care of treating people with chronic disease is so enormous and almost infinite that they realize that if they don't start intervening earlier on the spectrum of disease, that the whole healthcare system is going to go bankrupt and go down. And so they're shifting to a model where the providers, the people who are providing the healthcare, are now going to be financially responsible for the results. So that might seem kind of basic and everyone might have thought that that's already the way it is, but that's actually not how it is now at all. In healthcare, the providers largely have not been responsible for the results. They get paid whether they get results or not. And so, as you might imagine, there hasn't been a lot of incentive to perform well and to provide a high level of care because financially they would be reimbursed no matter what. But that's actually shifting now. And there are models like capitated payments where the payer, whether it's Medicare or insurance company, might say to the provider, okay, well, here's the target. You need to prevent diabetes or reverse it in X percentage of the patients we send you. And if you reach that target, then you're going to get this amount of money. If you exceed that target, you're going to get more money. You'll get this plus a bonus. And if you don't reach that target, you're going to get a lot less money. That's one example of how the model is changing, even within conventional medicine. And I think we're going to move in that direction one way or the other. We can either be more progressive and proactive in how we move in that direction, or quite frankly, the system is going to start to collapse and we're going to be absolutely forced to move in that direction. Now, I wrote the book with the hope that we can be more proactive, but I think we're going to get there one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, you say that spending on chronic disease worldwide will reach $47 trillion by 2030. I mean,
that's an incomprehensible number for most people.
I can't even comprehend that.
No.
So given that, it's definitely going to change. How can we be more proactive as health coaches or as people that just really care, even as patients? What can we do to make that happen?
I have a practitioner training program where I train doctors and other healthcare professionals in functional medicine. And we always ask people how they heard about functional medicine, how they heard about my work, et cetera. And one of the most common responses, which actually surprised me when I first started interviewing people, was the doctors had heard about this work from their patients. So their patients had brought in a copy of one of my books or maybe printed out an article. And I'm sure there are probably a lot of doctors out there that are really annoyed with me, patients bringing in my articles and books and stuff. But for the doctors that are open-minded, it actually spurred them to learn more about functional medicine or about my work in our training programs. And they actually then became interested and joined the program. And now they're out there practicing functional medicine. So that's one thing you can do, is just communicate with your doctor and tell them about other information and resources that are out there. We actually, as part of my book launch, The Unconventional Medicine, we put together a list of resources for people, ways that they can get involved depending on where they're coming from. You know, if you're just what I call a citizen activist, which is someone who's not necessarily a healthcare professional, but you're just really passionate about this stuff and you want to help, you want to move this forward, or whether you're a health coach or a nutritionist or you're a doctor. So if you go to unconventionalmedicinebook.com/share-your-story, or you just go to the main website and click on Share Your Story at the top, there are a few different ways that you can get involved and become part of the movement.
Excellent. And I'll definitely put that in the show notes for people. So how do people know then? And I can see that the health coach industry is going to grow and it has to grow for this to work. But then how does the general population know that they're in qualified hands? There's so many health coaching courses running now. And the difference between the course that you're running and the several other million courses out there, Chris, are just chalk and cheese. So how do we know that our health coach is qualified?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I think it is still kind of a little bit of the Wild West in terms of where we are with health coaching. And that's fine. I mean, it's a sign of what's to come. If you think about what happened in the Western United States in the 100 years after the Wild West, it's been a pretty phenomenal period of growth and expansion. And I think that's what's going to happen with health coaching. But the consequence of being still early days is that we don't yet have clearly defined standards for what a qualified health coach would be. And for that matter, that's even true to some extent in functional medicine and functional medicine practitioners. But I think it is changing in both cases. So, with functional medicine, you have groups like Institute for Functional Medicine and their certified practitioner program. You have my training, the ADAPT practitioner training program, which has made a name in the marketplace and is now well recognized as one of the premier certifications you can get in functional medicine. So I think over time, the ADAPT Health Coach training program will start to gain the same reputation in the marketplace. And because my consumer platform reaches a lot of people, people who are just looking for a health coach will recognize that name, the ADAPT name and my name, and that will be helpful. On a broader scale, we have now groups like the International Coaching Federation and also the International Consortium of Health and Wellness Coaches, or ICHWC, or ICHWC, as they're often referred to. So we don't have to say that lengthy acronym every time. They are working with groups like the National Board of Medical Examiners, which is a national organization in the US that defines standards for medical education. And so ICHWC has teamed up with the National Board of Medical Examiners to help define standards for health coach education. Their application process has been closed for new schools throughout the entire time we were creating the coaching program, but they just reopened the application. So we're going to apply, and I'm quite certain that we'll become an ICHWC approved school. So that will be another benchmark that people can use as one way of ascertaining whether a program is high quality. Now, there will be programs that are not improved that are still high quality, but you can use at least the ICHWC criteria for what should be in a coaching program to then look at the program you're evaluating to see if it ticks all the boxes and is including everything that should be in there to prepare you as a qualified health coach.
That's really great advice. And so once someone completes your course, and I know you've got 2 different courses depending on who you are, you do the course as a health coach. And what does the bigger picture look like after you've finished the course? What's your, I guess, plans for the future in terms of how you're going to tie all this together and make it easy for integrated health physicians to work with health coaches to actually provide the absolute best and cheapest option for their clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's been part of my vision from the start. When I launched the Kresser Institute, from the beginning, I knew that we would eventually train health coaches. And my intention has always been to train licensed practitioners like doctors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, naturopathic physicians, chiropractors, acupuncturists, etc., in the same philosophical and practical framework as the non-licensed practitioners like health coaches and nutritionists. And the advantage to that is that when somebody goes and sees an ADAPT-trained practitioner, and then they're also working with an ADAPT-trained health coach that the practitioner either has hired or is a referral relationship with, then that means they're going to have a continuity of care across both of those people that they see. So it's not like the current situation where you go to your doctor and they tell you to eat one way, usually a low-fat American Heart Association type of diet, and then you go to your nutritionist or health coach and they tell you to do keto or low carb diet, or, where you're getting really different information from different people. And that can be confusing for clients or patients. In this scenario, you have the practitioner and the coach and everyone on the care team operating under the same framework, which just means way higher quality of care, more continuity of care, less confusion for the patient, more streamlined approach for everybody involved. The way we're going to accomplish that is that, number one, we have a training program for both doctors and health coaches. We're the only organization that I'm aware of that offers training for both. I mean, you have lots of coaching training programs, a few practitioner training programs, but as far as I know, we're the only organization that is training both coaches and practitioners, especially in that same framework. Once we have a substantial number of practitioners and coaches that have been trained, and we're already really at that point as soon as the health coach cohort graduates next spring, then we will have networking events, both virtual and in person, to link up coaches and practitioners. We have a forum through the ADAPT Academy where coaches and practitioners can meet and interact and, establish connections. I will also be providing a lot of material for coaches in the coaching program about how to approach practitioners and propose a collaboration. And I have material in my practitioner training program about how to employ coaches, how to make the best use of them, how to utilize their skill set, and how to create a model that is a win-win-win. So a win for patients, a win for the coaches, and a win for the practitioners.
That's great. And you mentioned earlier too that you're going to team up with personal trainers and that sort of area as well. Is that going to be the whole part of that care team that you're talking about?
I don't anticipate that we'll be training personal trainers ourselves, but a health coach is a pretty broad designation and can include people from a wide variety of backgrounds. So we have personal trainers that are in the health coaching program, for example. We have doctors that are even in the health coaching program who are either, burned out on conventional medicine, or they want to incorporate more health coaching type of skills into their practice. Whether we train the personal trainers, I don't think we will be. I do see a personal trainer, for example, as being a great addition to a collaborative care team. I would see a psychologist or, a counselor or therapist as being a great part of a care team. We have various body workers that we refer people to that, aren't on staff, but we have referral relationships with them. We have all kinds of different people with different backgrounds and specialties that we refer our patients to, because I think when you look at, that's one of the big differences between the way we look at health in the functional model and in the conventional model is, everything is connected, and you can't be completely healthy physically if you're not healthy emotionally and psychologically, and vice versa. So that definitely needs to be part of the picture.
Excellent. And so I'm assuming your course covers a lot of the psychology side of things?
We definitely do in health coaching training program. Coaching is really largely about forming a relationship, a supportive relationship with the client. And so that involves knowing how to establish trust and rapport, knowing how to communicate, really kind of tune into your client's needs, knowing how to help your client to discover their own motivation and strategies for change rather than just telling them what to do, which is really more the medical model, the expert model that's been used for so many years, and it just doesn't work. We know that, and yet we just keep trying to do it in different ways over and over again. From the coaching perspective, it's really more about becoming an ally or a guide or a facilitator, and understanding positive psychology and being able to recognize strengths in your client and help them to further develop those strengths. That's a part of positive psychology in an area called character strengths. We cover that. We cover things like motivational interviewing, which helps clients to resolve ambivalence, which is a big obstacle for behavior change. That's essentially when someone has just as many reasons for not changing as they do for changing. That's my favorite definition of ambivalence. We've all been there. So there are a variety of techniques and methods that we teach coaches for how to work with people in a way that will empower them to become their own change agent rather than, always looking to someone else, like whether it's their doctor or some other authority for the answers, because that really doesn't work and it doesn't set someone up for long-term success.
Yeah, I really love that. I love your talks on motivational interviewing as well. In fact, I also like the podcast that you did about it too. So I'll link that in with the show notes because we have a lot of health coaches and want to become health coaches listening. I mean, you can always do another course. And if you're thinking about doing another course, this is definitely the one to do. So we're going to link to the course in the show notes as well. And talking about a few of those coaches, I actually had a fair few health coaches or health practitioners actually asked me some questions to ask you. So I must ask the most well-known and smartest people in the industry about low carbs. So a couple of our listeners wanted to get your perspective on some particular issues in relation to that. Roxanne asks, what would be some reasons your fasting insulin, A1C, would come back slightly elevated, like around 6, if you're on a low-carb diet, say 50 to 75 grams a day? Do you think her average 100 glucose appears high?
That's a little bit high. An A1C of 6, I would definitely consider to be borderline high. That's technically in the pre-diabetic range, at least the ranges we use in the US. Above 5.6 is considered to be high normal or on a spectrum of progression towards unhealthy blood sugar. The first thing I have to say is that A1C itself is not a very accurate marker in individuals. It was really developed as a screening tool for large population studies, and it doesn't require fasting. So that was one big advantage of it for screening purposes, and it's cheap and it can be done quickly, and it's a pretty standardized test. So it works really well for screening in big populations, but there are some issues with it which make it less reliable as a marker for individual blood sugar. And I have an article about this. If you type in A1C and Kresser, my last name, it will pop right up at the top of the search results. And I won't go into detail here because it would take too much time, but they can familiarize themselves with why A1C itself on its own shouldn't be used as a reliable blood sugar marker. That said, if the questioner has also had their fasting blood sugar tested and it's maybe in the high 90s or low 100s and there are some other signs of high blood sugar, then there are several things to consider. One is that there are many other things that can affect blood sugar levels that don't have anything to do with diet, or at least aren't directly related. Cortisol levels are a big one. Cortisol is a hormone produced by the adrenal glands during stress response. And one of cortisol's main jobs is to actually bring blood sugar up when it has fallen too low. And that's great when our blood sugar actually is too low. But if we're under chronic stress, the continual inappropriate release of cortisol will actually raise blood sugar almost independently of what we're eating. So that's something to check into for sure. Gut infections, things like SIBO or dysbiosis, disrupted gut microbiome, parasites, fungal overgrowth. Those can all cause a chronic low-grade inflammatory response in the gut, which can lead to leaky gut, which in turn can cause inflammation, which can raise blood sugar as well. You have things like heavy metal toxicity that can increase blood sugar. But it could be, depending on the circumstances, if someone is still significantly overweight, that can on its own cause insulin resistance and blood sugar. And if, they've just started this diet, for example, it may just be a question of a little bit more time. Once they've been able to lose a little bit more weight and become more insulin sensitive, then the numbers will usually start to trend down again.
That totally makes sense. And that's why my next question from Linda really confuses me as well, because she's been paleo for 6 years.
Yeah.
And 50 to 75 grams of carbs a day. Her A1C is 5.7 and insulin's 3.2, and yet her glucose are around that 97 to 99.
Fasting insulin is a really great marker because it's one of the first markers that goes out of whack in insulin resistant state. It's been shown to precede abnormal fasting glucose and A1C levels, sometimes by several years. So there are a couple of considerations here. One, if the person is normal weight and they're eating, as you said, 50 to 75 grams of carbohydrate, and those are healthy whole food carbohydrates, which I assume they are if they've been paleo, then a few considerations would be what I mentioned about A1C, just making sure that's providing an accurate read. And then the fasting blood sugar, if that's being done in the morning, you need to do some other fasting readings during the day with a glucometer, which is a device that measures blood sugar, to make sure that those high fasting readings are not just the dawn effect. So the dawn effect is like an early morning rise in blood sugar that can happen on a person who's been eating a higher fat, low carb diet, because in that situation, the body becomes more accustomed to processing fat for fuel than carbohydrates. And the cells can become kind of naturally insulin resistant overnight because they don't need the additional glucose. And then the patient wakes up in the morning and the blood sugar levels are kind of high normal like that. But if that's true and that's what's happening, then what you should expect to see is you eat breakfast and then blood sugar levels will go up a little bit, as they do after you eat. But then after breakfast, maybe a couple hours later, if you test again in the fasted state, then you would expect the blood sugar to be normal, like in the 80s, high 70s, or in the 80s, or perhaps the low 90s. So if you see that, then that means you're probably experiencing this dawn effect that's not really a pathological problem. It's just a reflection of the changes that have happened in the body in terms of processing glucose. Another possibility would be, as I said, to look at other causes of elevated blood sugar that are not diet related. As I mentioned, high cortisol is probably really at the top of the list. I mean, we live in all of the developed world, not just the United States, that is just constantly on now. It's a 24/7 culture these days. And I was just reading some statistics that almost 60% of Americans aren't taking their vacations. And even when they do, most people are working and checking their email. The boundary between work and not working has pretty much been demolished with smartphones and internet and other technologies, where people are taking their work home with them and really not getting enough rest and rejuvenation. And that takes a toll. And, I would say 70 to 80% of the patients that come into my practice have some issue with their HPA axis, whether it's, high cortisol or low cortisol, or a mixture of high and low, or, low DHEA or other kind of problem there. And that's almost certainly affecting blood sugar. There's, just decades of research that illustrate that connection.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I'm glad you brought up cortisol. And I'm not sure whether they've actually investigated cortisol or not. So that's a really good thing to do. And then assuming that there are issues with that, I won't ask you what to do from there, because I know this. Move to the country, stop your stress in your life, all of that sort of thing.
I'm glad you brought that up. So most people, of course, will not be able to do either of those two things, move to the country or stop the stress in their life. So it's really important to not set that up as the expectation, because if we do, then most people will just feel like there's nothing they can do and they won't do anything. one of the principles of health coaching or behavior change in general, I would say, is called shrinking the change. So this means taking big change like manage your stress and breaking it up into very small, actionable steps that, you can take and be successful with, and then build momentum from that will then lead to another small step, which then leads to another small step. And before you know it, you've taken a series of small steps that collectively add up into a big effect. And what I've noticed after a decade of treating patients and teaching and training clinicians and other practitioners is that most of us expect that we'll find some big smoking gun or some silver bullet or some hugely significant kind of change or intervention that's going to make a big impact in our health. And what I've found to be true is the opposite, that it's usually a series of very small changes that, when collectively put together, add up to a big effect. And so in the context of stress management, that could look like making sure you're getting 8 hours of sleep, in bed for 8 hours at least. So going to bed an hour earlier. It might look like using heart math, inner balance, or Muse, or any other number of new tools that can help you to track your heart rate variability and then learn to change that and put yourself into a parasympathetic nervous system response, which is the opposite of fight or flight, using neurofeedback or biofeedback, using any of the numerous apps out there like Headspace or mindfulness to learn a mindfulness or meditation practice, or doing a class in mindfulness-based stress reduction at a local hospital or medical center. It might be just learning to say no a little bit more often than you have been so far. Not a huge change, but taking on fewer obligations and commitments. It might mean learning to cultivate more positive experiences in your life. So Rick Hansen, for example, he's a neuropsychologist, and he wrote a book called Hardwiring Happiness that is full of research that shows that, where we put our focus without changing anything in our life, but just changing what we focus on and where we put our attention can make a huge difference in our quality of life and our experience of the world around us. So a lot of small changes can really add up to having a big effect.
That is really, really great advice. And I know so many people are perfectionists and they think they have to make this massive life change. And just those small steps can do so much. So I really appreciate that. And also giving us some actual live examples about how we can implement those. That's excellent. I'm not sure if you want to go here, but a lot of women often say to me, and Tina actually asks, what can perimenopausal women do who find themselves gaining weight, even following a very strict paleo lifestyle?
Yeah, that's a good question and a common scenario. So in perimenopause, what's happening is the burden of hormone production is shifting from the ovaries, where it has been, throughout the menstruating woman's life, to the adrenal glands, actually, which is what will assume the burden of ongoing hormone production once the ovaries really stop doing that. So we were just talking about the HPA axis and its role in the stress response and, governing our stress tolerance and how we respond to stress. Well, it turns out it has a particularly important role in women who are entering menopause, because if we understand that the burden of hormone production shifts from the ovaries to the adrenals, then it becomes clear that making sure that the HPA axis and the adrenals are in really good shape for a woman who's in perimenopause and entering menopause is absolutely critical, because that will be the system that really determines how easy or difficult that transition is. And so the better shape that the HPA axis is in, and that comes down to healthy diet, getting enough sleep, getting the right amount of physical activity, not too little and not too much, managing stress in the ways that we talked about. Don't have to move out into the country or quit your job or anything. Just making a series of small changes can really have a big impact on the HPA axis. And then that in turn can help with female hormone production. So what's happening there in the situation where a woman is gaining a lot of weight, it could be an issue with cortisol production, and or it could be an issue with declining levels of estrogen and progesterone. But either way, I've found that the best way to intervene from a functional perspective is to focus on the HPA axis first and do as much as you can there. And only then, if that's not fruitful, consider more direct intervention on the level of the sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. For me, I will almost always use herbs first because I'm an herbalist by training, among other things. And I just think that's a better approach for many women than using bioidentical replacement hormones. In our practice, we do consider bioidentical hormone replacement, particularly for menopausal women, not as much perimenopausal women, if that is appropriate. And all of the other avenues have been already explored and haven't gotten us where we need to get to.
That's really interesting. And that's great that you mentioned that, because a lot of people miss that step, I think. They don't even consider the HPA axis and they go straight to hormones.
That's right. And the problem there, as I'm sure many listeners who've been down that road will attest to, is that it's not really addressing the root cause of the problem, which of course is the fundamental principle of functional medicine. And what can happen then is the hormones either don't work as well as they would otherwise, or they do work for a period of time and then they stop working. And then women have to, either increase the dose or switch to a different form. And it becomes this really difficult thing to manage. And that's often because those more fundamental aspects of hormone regulation have not been addressed.
Interesting. And look, I've just got one more question from you from a great health coach, Julie Ralston, who often listens to a person that I know you have a lot of respect for too, Sarah Ballantyne. And in fact, I'll link to a really great podcast that you did with her earlier. She wanted to know what your sort of take is on IF and keto for women, especially in regards to the research that Sarah's done. She mentions in her episode 305 about why insulin is important. You probably haven't heard the actual podcast, but I'm sure you're familiar with the research she's done, basically saying that actually perhaps low carb for women may not be the best option.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. I mean, I know Sarah pretty well, and we both agree that anytime you make a statement about something that is meant to apply to everyone from a health perspective, it's almost always false. There's, whatever that statement is, whether you're talking about diet or exercise or anything, there is really no one size fits all approach. And that's a drum I've been beating for a long time, since I wrote my first book. And well before that, I've been writing about the importance of tailoring our diet to our genetics, our epigenetics, our health status, whether we're healthy or well, our goals, are we a sedentary office worker that's 60 pounds overweight and diabetic, or are we a lean, competitive athlete that's preparing for, an upcoming competition? Those are two totally different scenarios that require different approaches. I've long been an advocate of customizing our diet approach to our individual situation, and that includes our sex. So men and women have, of course, a lot of similarities physiologically, but there are some key differences. I think those do actually influence what might be optimal. And again, after a decade of treating patients and running extensive lab tests and lab work with all of my patients, I would say that it's not uncommon for women to develop issues when they go on a very low carb diet, especially for an extended period of time. And I can give you a theory on why that's the case. A ketogenic diet or a low carb diet or intermittent fasting, those are all, in some ways, they act on the body as a stressor. And not all stress is bad. Some stress is what we call hormetic, which means it induces a positive adaptation. So weightlifting or exercise is the most well-known hormetic stressor. So if you go to the gym and you lift weights, you do a set that's heavy enough that you eventually can't lift the weight anymore. You train to failure. Well, what's happening there is you're breaking down your muscle fibers. And when you rest, and that's why rest is so important between workouts, what's happening is your body is engaging in this hormetic adaptive response. From an evolutionary perspective, it's saying, I don't want to be in that situation where I can't meet that challenge again. So I'm going to rebuild the muscle so that it's stronger, so that the next time I face that challenge, I'll be prepared. That's basically how it works. So hormetic stressors can be very beneficial. But what happens if someone has such a high level of background stress already? So let's imagine a woman who is a mom, who's also working outside of the home, who is burning the candle at both ends because of that. She gets home from work, she's preparing the meal. She's helping get her kids to bed. And then after everyone's in bed, that's the only time she has to respond to some emails and get some work done. So she's staying up until midnight, looking at the screen, and then she's not sleeping well because she's been looking at the screen and that's interfering with her sleep. And she's up at, 5 or 6 in the morning. And then let's say she's also training hard at the gym. Maybe she got into CrossFit and she's doing WODs and doing very intense training. And then she's also now doing intermittent fasting and keto. So in that scenario, you have such a high level of background stress that adding additional stressors like a ketogenic diet or intermittent fasting, which could otherwise be beneficial against a background of low stress, where it would have a hormetic effect, now it's actually having a maladaptive effect. You're essentially creating more stress on top of stress. And then that can lead to, HPA axis dysfunction, fatigue, insomnia, and even rebound weight gain in many cases, which seems counterintuitive, but it happens quite a lot.
That was a really good example, and I'm sure a lot of women can relate to that. In fact, I thought you may have visited my house recently, but,
exactly.
but I'm actually one of these women too that don't go too low carb because all the other stresses, your body doesn't know the difference between stress and stress, I assume. So it takes on all of this as just stress.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
My question then would be, don't men face this exact same scenario?
They do, but I think
they don't work as hard.
Yeah. I think it's a case-by-case situation, right? And it depends on what the roles are in the home. And I have to be careful not to make broad statements here because a lot has changed over the years. But I think you could say that traditionally with the role, and still to this day in many situations, women are playing multiple roles where they're, the primary caregiver to the children, and they may still also be doing a lot of the work around the house as well as working outside of the home. And that can be true for men too, of course, but there are also the physiological differences. Women have different hormone production, different hormone patterns than men. They menstruate. If you look at studies on men and women and their relative risk for heart disease and other conditions, they're different. So we know that there are real physiological differences that are measurable and not imaginary. And I think some of those are also at play when it comes to low carb and diet issues that Sarah has talked about, differences perhaps in women and insulin production and how insulin is connected to estrogen. Estrogen metabolism, and those will have obviously a very different impact in a male who produces much more testosterone than estrogen, at least when things are going well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. So look, you're an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate you sharing all of this with us. Is there anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with in terms of, a lifestyle tip or a tip for people that want to become a health coach, anything at all that you'd like to share?
One of the things I've been paying a lot of attention to recently is technology addiction and how smartphones and internet and social media and other technologies have really had a huge impact on our health. It certainly has been a lot of attention on how it affects things like our relationships and our productivity. But there's also a growing amount of research that shows real and significant health impacts. And it's something that I think many of us are not aware of. These technologies are so new and they've so rapidly taken up a huge place in our life that I think a lot of people are just not even aware of how they have affected their experience of themselves and the world around them, their relationships, etc. And I think it's a big deal for a lot of people. And it's kind of the elephant in the room for people who are trying to optimize their health. If you're paying a ton of attention to your diet and you're, trying to exercise and manage your stress, yet you are looking at your phone 80 plus times a day and you're waking up during the night to respond to text messages and you're not able to really focus on your kids or people around you because you're distracted by your phone. It makes a big difference and it takes a toll and one that, as I mentioned, often goes unexamined. So I'm actually going to be doing a talk on this at PaleoFX next year. I just submitted my presentation proposal and I did a 2-hour presentation on it for the coaching program. Actually, one of my favorite resources for people who do want to bring more attention to this is a book by Catherine Price called How to Break Up with Your Phone, which is a great title. And it's a 30-day plan, very easy to follow and really helpful, and just a lot of really insightful and practical strategies for how to just bring your relationship with technology under control. It's not about, going cold turkey, because most of us can't do that and don't need to do that, don't want to do that. It's more about getting in control of technology rather than letting technology control us, and being more intentional with the decisions we make around that. And I think anyone who's working as a health coach or thinking about working as a health coach needs to be aware of this as well, because many of your clients that you work with are going to be struggling with this, whether they know it or not. So that's something else I've had my attention on recently.
That's excellent, Chris. And I look forward to listening to that talk you're going to do at PaleoFX. We actually had Andy Gulpin on the show, and I'm sure you've read his Unplugged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love that.
Yeah. And so it's funny, though, I can tell how old you are, because you said that people look at their phone 80 times a day. I think it's more like 900 for the younger generation.
That's true. So, that's the average. But yeah, the millennials, it's much worse. I think with the millennials, it's something like 85 or 90% have the phone in the bedroom and are checking it throughout the night. So, I mean, that's just shocking to me. I am 44, so I'm of the generation that remembers not having cell phones and social media.
Same with me, and I much prefer it. So, I mean, yeah, start reading those two books to start with, and then come and listen to Chris's talk. But I totally agree with you. I think that there needs to be so much more attention placed on things like that. Chris, just before I let you go, a little question that we ask all our guests on the show. Do you have a tattoo?
I don't. That's something I've never done. Don't have any objections to it. I just never found anything that I identified with enough to tattoo and permanent, or semi-permanent ink on my body.
I just wondered whether you might have an adapt or die.
Yeah, maybe I should. That's close. That's pretty close. But I've got a few buttons, that's for sure.
Awesome. Maybe just stick to the buttons or the pin that you have at the moment.
I think for now, yeah.
Excellent, Chris. Look, thanks again. We'll link to everything in the show notes, including your websites, your podcast, how people can find out more about your courses, where they can find you at PaleoFX next year.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Ali. It's been great. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.